Politics Live.
It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
You could end this Ukrainian-Russia war in 24 hours.
Yeah.
How?
I would tell Putin, you gotta settle. I would tell Zelensky, you gotta settle. I would get a settlement in 24 hours.
That was last year, but despite a 2.5-hour phone call with President Putin, strikes against Ukraine continue. Israel bombards Gaza for a second night as the Israeli Prime Minister confirms the ceasefire is over.
Israel will fight, and Israel will win. We will bring our people home, and we will destroy Hamas. We will not relent until we achieve all these vital goals.
Controversial tactics, but are President Trump's policies reducing the number of illegal crossings into the United States?
My constituents, my friends, my family are very angry about this, and they do not think this is the kind of action that a Labour government takes.
I welcome her proactive approach to reasonable adjustments and the £1 billion support package to get disabled people back into work where they can work.
Labour MPs clash over the government's cuts to welfare. Will those disagreements spill over at Prime Minister's questions? We'll bring you that live at noon. Joining us today, Labour MP Nadia Whittome, Conservative MP Harriet Cross, Naomi Smith from the pro-EU think tank Best for Britain, and the Associate Editor of The Telegraph, Camilla Tominey. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Well, you heard Donald Trump saying he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Well, here's what the American president had to say last night about his phone call with Vladimir Putin on Fox News.
And I think we had a great call. It lasted almost 2 hours. Talked about a lot of things and toward getting it to peace. And we talked about other things also.
But, in fact, the Russian president has not agreed to a full ceasefire. There has been some sort of commitment to pausing attacks on energy infrastructure, but he is still sticking to his list of conditions, including withdrawal of any European military aid, amongst other things. So promises have been pretty vague. And then there were drone strikes overnight from Russia into Ukraine. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Nadia, has Donald Trump's big peace mission failed?
I think it has, and I think it shows that Putin just can't be trusted. Not only has he rejected a ceasefire, but what little he did agree to, pausing attacks on energy infrastructure, he went back on in a matter of hours. I think it's very worrying that one of the conditions that he's laying down for a full ceasefire is no military aid or intelligence sharing with Ukraine, because it could well be that he's trying to weaken Ukraine and then will attack again because, as I've said, he can't be trusted. I think it's very worrying seeing Trump and Putin working together to undermine Ukraine like this. I mean, if you compare that 2-hour phone call with the way that Trump treated Zelensky in the Oval Office, he's cozying up to someone who has been indicted as a suspected war criminal by the ICC, and that's because they're both cut from the same political cloth. Well, they both hail from the international far right.
It was a big boast, Camilla, by Donald Trump to say, I can end this in 24 hours, and now we're in the situation we are. There is no ceasefire agreed by Russia. So has Donald Trump's big peace mission failed?
Yeah, I think Putin's called his bluff. You've got this wily old KGB man. I think he's running rings around the US president. The so-called art of the deal hasn't materialised here. We've now got a non-ceasefire. It only really benefits Putin to have no attacks on infrastructure, because the one thing that the Ukrainians were actually getting increasingly good at was attacking Russian energy plants. And, of course, that suits his purposes down to the ground. They were on the phone for nearly 2 hours. I mean, in terms of diplomacy, well, precisely, Joe. You know, you want to know what else they are talking about and what other deals they're making behind the scenes. In terms of diplomacy, they've come out with some ice hockey match, which I would imagine is a bit of an insult, frankly, to the Ukrainian people. So there's been a lot of, you know, bragging and a lot of boasting, even afterwards. The statement that he put on Truth Social, making out as if this was somehow a victory for his negotiation skills. I think it was a failure.
What do you think? Do you think it's failed?
I think that if you claim that you can end the conflict within 24 hours, one of two things is true. Either you simply have so little understanding of geopolitics as to fail to realise the gulf between the Ukrainian position and Putin's position and how far apart those two sides were from reaching any kind of settled peace, or you are actually allying yourself with another strong man, another bully, another man that is admired by Trump in terms of how he handles his country. And where does this leave the UK? Well, our most powerful ally now seems to be aligned to our most dangerous enemy. And I would argue that that means we need to have a much faster negotiation with Europe about our Defence and Security Pact.
Do you think there's anything that can be salvaged? I mean, apart from this commitment, vague commitment to stopping bombing infrastructure?
I think what's really important is that whatever situation is developing there, and it will continue to develop over the next few days, sort of as the details of the phone conversation between President Trump and President Putin develop and we understand more, is actually how whatever is decided translates into a lasting peace. Because this ceasefire that's being spoken about at the moment is temporary. It's 30 days. Ukraine's big concern is that just gives the Russians time to recuperate, to restock and come back again for more. We need to make sure whatever happens, it's sustainable and that the international community is robust behind Zelensky, behind Ukraine, because they are the people in this war who are the innocent party who have been attacked for years now by Russia. This started back there. Every Ukrainian I've heard speak about this goes back to 2014 in Crimea. This is a continuation of what we've seen over now more than a decade.
Well, what about the other war that Donald Trump said he could bring to some sort of conclusion? I mean, the Gaza ceasefire brokered by the US is over after Israel restarted airstrikes in the region a few nights ago. The death toll reported to be over 400. People, of course, have moved back into the region, including the head of the Hamas government, deemed a terrorist organisation by the US and the UK. The Israeli government said it is the group's refusal to agree to terms palatable to them, and the strikes were carried out with the full knowledge of the US administration. What should the UK government's response be?
Let's be clear, first of all. By killing hundreds of Palestinians, including at least 174 children, and blockading aid, Israel has categorically violated the ceasefire agreement and continued its genocide of the Palestinian people.
Although that isn't what Number 10 said, did they? They made the Foreign Secretary row back on what he said, and he agreed with you, David Lammy, initially. Let's just have a listen to what David Lammy said about this in the Commons a few days ago.
This is a breach of international law. Israel, quite rightly, must defend its own security. But we find the lack of aid, it's now been 15 days since aid got into Gaza, unacceptable.
He is talking about, just to be clear, the 16-day blockade because it preceded the airstrikes. He then rode back, if we show you this headline in The Independent, Lammy rose back after saying Israel broke international law in Gaza because the Number 10 spokesperson said they were at risk of breaking international law. What was your response to that?
Israel has blatantly violated international law. What the UK needs to do now is hold Israel to account. And we have not just a moral duty, but also a legal duty to do that. And that means a full arms embargo, sanctions like those that we have rightly put on Russia. It means no longer providing diplomatic cover to Israel at the UN. We've got to stand up to the Israeli government and not allow these far-right politicians to do this in the world, or international law ceases to mean anything, and that harms all of us.
Who stands up for the hostages in your scenario? Who stands up for the Israeli people? Who stands up for the mothers and fathers that saw their children brutally murdered in front of them on October the 7th? Who stands up for the women who were raped before they were brutally murdered by Hamas terrorists? It's such a one-sided view, this. Why isn't the word genocide ever used about Hamas's behaviour on October the 7th?
No, it's not a one-sided view.
It is.
Absolutely. I have, from the very beginning, called for the hostages to be returned. What do you think bombing Gaza... No, let me ask you this. How does bombing Gaza help the hostages?
How does keeping the hostages help the Gazan people? That's the part of the ceasefire deal. It's been very clear that Israel's got a right to defend itself, as have all countries. A terrorist atrocity was carried out on October the 7th. As part of the ceasefire deal, the hostages were meant to be returned. Some of the hostages that were meant to be returned were actually killed in captivity. We now know how some of the hostages were kept in captivity. Until those hostages are returned, there can be no ceasefire at all. I'm not advocating the slaying of women and children in Gaza.
But you're advocating for it to continue.
No, what I'm saying is that there is never any dialogue from you and people like you who are constantly banging on about...
What do you mean, people like me?
People like you who are accusing the Israelis of genocide without taking any
people
responsibility.
Like Amnesty International, like the UN Special
People like you, Nadia, without actually
like
acknowledging...
No, say what you really mean by
I'm
that.
saying exactly what I mean, which is why don't you acknowledge the genocide that has been carried out by Hamas against the Israeli people and also at the harm of their own people? This is a terrorist organisation that has been using Palestinians as human shields.
Hamas, I've unequivocally...
You didn't in the original thing that you said. It was all very one-sided.
The very first thing I said...
Well, let Nadia
I'm consistent. I condemn both. Why don't you?
But Nadia, do you think the hostages should now be released? Would that then...
Obviously, I've said again and again that they should be released. Of course they should.
If they are released, that takes away from Hamas's perspective any part that they can use in negotiations. Has the Israeli bombardment, restarting airstrike, put those hostages' lives at risk?
I think the point is here is that how can the Israelis position themselves if they've still got their own people in captivity in Gaza? What is Netanyahu meant to do? What's he meant to turn around and say to the families of those hostages?
Why doesn't he listen to the families? Because the families are calling for this to end. Okay, not just for the Palestinian people, but also for their own loved ones who are being kept as hostages.
Why does Hamas continue to allow the Palestinian people to be used as human shields within their own territory?
Well, I'm not here as a spokesperson for Hamas.
Well, let's hope nobody is.
But I've condemned them over and over again.
Nadia,
when will you condemn the Israeli government for its genocide of the Palestinian people?
Because I don't think... I don't agree with you that it's international law. I don't agree with the language of genocide.
OK, you don't have to agree that it's genocide.
Israel is defending its own territory against a prescribed terrorist group. I'd like to know why nobody seems to call out the fact that the hostages are still there and that Hamas... If we have all of this talk about we must free Palestine. Free Palestine from whom? The Israelis or their Hamas terrorist captors? Because the people who are really damaging the people of Gaza right now are Hamas.
It's both.
It's not acknowledged, and it's not acknowledged fully enough in debates like this.
Are you disappointed with the government so far that they haven't taken the sort of steps that you are calling for in terms of a full arms embargo and sanctions?
Yes, I am. I'm pleased that the government has suspended some arms exports, though a relatively small proportion of them. I'm glad that they've sanctioned illegal outposts and violent settlers and organisations supporting that. But they could, and I have long argued that they should, be ending all arms sales, doing things like, for example, banning imports from illegal settlements, revoking the 2030 roadmap, which deepens economic trade and security ties with Israel. And if you compare that to what we've rightly done with Russia, in February...
Are you comparing the Israeli government to the Russian government, to Vladimir Putin?
Yes, both of them. Well, wouldn't you? Both of them.
One launched an illegal invasion of another country, Ukraine. The other retaliated against a terrorist attack that we have literally this week had an APPG report documenting the absolute atrocities carried out against the Israeli people on October the 7th. And you think there's an equivalence between somebody responding to a terrorist attack on their own soil and somebody invading another country?
Harriet, let me come to you. I'll come back to you, Nadia.
Yeah,
but Harriet, first of all, what is your reaction, and what do you think the government should do? The government here.
We do recognise both sides. There are innocent civilians on both sides of this who are being caught up in this tragedy, and it is a tragedy. But that does not mean that we cannot be strong and steadfast as an international community. We must stop the suffering on both sides.
And how does the UK government try and do that?
The best way to do that is to get the release of the 59 hostages who are left in Gaza. Without those hostages being released, innocent hostages who were taken on October 7th, without them being released, there is no way that Israel can look their civilians in the eye and say, we have done everything we can to return our citizens to our soil. There is one democracy in this, there's one terrorist group in this, and I know which side of the fence I sit on in terms of who I support.
Should the UK government condemn what Netanyahu's government has done in terms of restarting the airstrikes? I mean, there are a lot of people who say he's done it for his own political, internal reasons, breaking the ceasefire. Should the UK government condemn it?
What I think the UK needs to think about is its own allies in all of this. We talked about it in the context of Putin. Trump took credit for the ceasefire in Israel-Gaza, and I think he needs to take some credit for its collapse as well. Remember, we were meant to be having a second phase of the ceasefire, subject to negotiations, and it's clear now that that avenue was not exhausted, if indeed it was even attempted. And so the best option, surely, for getting the hostages out of Gaza, which is something we all agree on needs to happen and happen quickly, and then end civilian suffering there, would be to have moved forward into that. But when there is missed opportunity after missed opportunity to advance peace negotiations, one has to conclude that at some point peace might not be the priority.
You wanted to have a final word, Nadia?
Yeah, I think you should retract the suggestion that I'm siding with a terrorist organisation. I think both of you should. I stand against war crimes and crimes against humanity, no matter which state commits them. The question is, do you? Obviously not.
No, we were just
We've
clarifying.
heard that you don't.
No, I think Harry and Ina were clarifying the point. We weren't saying who you were siding with. We were merely saying that when we were choosing between a democracy, a functioning democracy in the Middle East, and a terrorist organisation, we're going to go for the democracy over the terrorists.
That's
just to clarify.
If we're talking about democracy,
I'm clarifying my
losing
position.
significant support, particularly, as Nadia mentioned, from many of the families who are so desperate to get people back that they do not want a resumption of violence because that will put it at risk. So I think, you know, if he is losing support at home, then surely the UK needs to, and the rest of the world needs to be asking more of him and start considering what is in the best interest of the Israeli people and people in Gaza.
Well, let's talk. Suppressing the voices of the brave Israelis who are trying to stop aid trucks from being blocked, who are standing up against their government. Yes. What do you have to say to them?
Some of those pro-Palestinian Israelis were killed on October the 7th. Lots of people who absolutely wanted to bridge the gap between Gaza and Israel. Also, it's for the Israeli people to decide who they want their next leader to be. Of course, we're aware of fierce opposition against Netanyahu. I'm not advocating everything that Netanyahu's done. I just don't like the imbalance. I don't like the imbalance of a conversation that only applies the term genocide to one side when you've got a terrorist group that has raped and murdered women on October the 7th. I don't agree with the positioning of it.
Nadia?
I've said everything that I have to say on this.
Well,
I've unequivocally condemned Hamas. I also condemn the genocide and the flagrant breach.
Did Hamas carry out genocide on October the 7th or not?
Hang on.
Let me finish. And the flagrant breaches of international law that the Israeli government has committed again and again and again.
Let's talk about welfare. Big drama yesterday as we reported live on air, the statement from the Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall. Well, let's talk about some of the changes that the government announced, or certainly the response to them when it came to sickness benefits. Liz Kendall said and told MPs that they were planning to make cuts of at least £5 billion a year to the projected welfare spend and make it harder for people with less severe conditions to claim some disability payments. Well, let's take a look at the flavour in some of the papers, some of the opinion pieces. In the Daily Mail, Andrew Neil, my old colleague, is that it, he says? An opportunity of a generation to tackle Britain's bloated welfare bill has been squandered and will all be poorer for it. This was the Daily Mirror. No relief in cruel war on poor and disabled. Hard Labour. And finally, this is how The Times covered it. Labour has grasped the nettle on benefits, but it's only a start. Liz Kendall's much-needed reforms to the welfare state will help end the benefits trap. But the government must go further and faster to slash unsustainable costs. Well, that's what the papers are saying. Some of them. What do the public think about welfare? Let's talk to the pollster Joe Twyman from Delta Poll. Hello to you. Joe, will these cuts be popular with the public?
Well, when you ask people about specific cuts, specific policies, it's likely that some will prove popular and some will prove less popular. But the reality is it's about a lot more than just the individual policies that have been announced. For the 25 years that I've been doing this, consistently a majority and sometimes a large majority of people have felt that reform of the welfare system is necessary. There's pretty much large levels of agreement on that. But how it is to be reformed is where the public is divided. Around equal numbers think that we spend too much or indeed too little or the right amount. And so there's no real consensus on how to move forward. And I think what will determine whether these are a success or not is not the response that the public gives to individual questions about specific policies, but whether, generally speaking, the belief is that these changes are being made in a way that is fair, in a way that is necessary, and in a way that is effective. So essentially it's less about the policies and more about the messaging and the delivery in terms of public opinion.
Has that changed much? Those broad sort of principles, the equal numbers in terms of public polling when it comes to welfare?
No, not very much. Not when you look at the particularly long term. In most recent polls, we have seen around about 2/3 of people believing that reform of welfare is necessary, and that's up from sort of 55% over the last few years. But generally speaking, this is a long-standing trend rather than an individual fluctuation, and it really demonstrates how this is a long-standing belief. But similarly, at the same time, people do believe in large numbers that a welfare system should take place, that the least fortunate in society should be helped, that there should be a safety net. But at the same time, large numbers believe that the welfare trap that has been talked about is something that should be avoided. But casting over all of this is the fact that most people actually don't really understand much about the welfare system in terms of, for instance, the amount of money that's spent or the amount of money that is wasted through fraud and inefficiencies.
Joe Twyman, thank you very much. Harriet, listening to that in terms of equal numbers, feeling that it's either too generous or it's too harsh, does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me because there's always a range of opinions on everything. But I think if we look at the actual numbers and the projection of where the numbers are meant to go, it is staggering. And it is clear that welfare is an area where there is a huge amount of spend and therefore a huge amount of reason for it to be taken seriously. But we look at it and cut it. Of course, the reforms that were announced yesterday, the projected is going to be about $5 billion worth of savings by the end of the decade. But firstly, that's not confirmed because we haven't seen the impact assessment. That's still with the ONS to confirm, which is going to be another week. So we don't actually know what the impact's going to be.
And you'd like it to be higher?
Well, it needs to be higher. So we've got 100 by the end of the decade.
Where would you cut? I mean, we heard Liz Kendall spell out in great detail where she thinks those savings are going to come. If you wanted to do the $12 billion, which was what was suggested by the last Conservative government, where would it come from?
I think it's really important is actually to look at where in the system, where it's working, where it's not, and importantly, where there's fraud in the system, because there is fraud in the system, and there's places in the system where either there's people taking 0.2%. There's people taking over more benefits than they are responsible to, people taking access to benefits which they aren't exactly the best ones for them. Money is not always the best way to address people's problems. It also needs to look at actually, is there a way we can help people return to work? Is there ways that we can help people access sort of different medical needs and sort of ways to help them return to work? But money is not always the solution to every problem.
Nadia, did you and were you convinced by the government's argument that this is a moral mission, that it is a moral mission to prevent millions of young people, particularly being left, to use the government's words, literally on the scrap heap if they come out of school and they're put straight onto benefits, that this will address it?
No, I wasn't. There is no moral case for doing this. And to be honest, the economic case is flimsy when we could get the money from other places by, for example, wealth taxes or adjusting the fiscal rules. That's what fiscal rules are supposed to be there for. They're not supposed to be ironclad.
Do you think the money can be taken, though, from welfare? Do you think there is $5 billion or more that can be taken?
If you implemented a 2% tax on assets over 10 million, that would raise 24 billion a year. If you equalised capital gains tax and income tax, an idea so radical that Nigel Lawson, the Conservative Chancellor, supported it, that would raise billions more. If you adjusted the fiscal rules, that could raise billions.
Yes, I suppose
there is no sugarcoating it. These are the biggest disability benefits cuts since the OBR was created in 2010. I'm terrified about what that will mean for the up to 1.2 million people who are set to lose thousands and thousands of pounds every year by the end of this decade.
Well, let's discuss briefly the wealth tax. What about that idea? And Diane Abbott, I think, said I think it was 2% on assets worth over £10 million.
The issue of a wealth tax or any of these taxes is a very blunt, and they doesn't take account of behavioural change. We've already seen since the budget a huge exodus of millionaires from the country because of the level of tax that is being brought in on them. So these might sound great in principle, but they do not bring in the money that's expected. The wealth creators, who actually then also create the employment that we need people who are seeking work to go into, it has a knock-on effect down the line. So it's not an easy answer, any of this. And a wealth tax has more impact than the policy headline suggests.
I mean, the IFS...
The
Institute for Fiscal Studies yesterday, Paul Johnson, the director, did cast doubt on whether you could get that amount of money and whether it would be effective enough. But Naomi, on the actual cuts itself, was it the right thing to do for this Labour government to do something about welfare?
It is right that we need to help those who can and want to get back into work to do so. I think everybody is in agreement with that. There needs to be far more support, but that support will cost money. Any serious welfare reforms actually cost quite a lot of money in the short term in order to realise longer-term cuts. But I think there has been just far too much punching down. We hear in politics all the time, we had to make tough choices. I would argue there's very little tough about cutting foreign aid for people who are the most vulnerable in the entire world, and cutting PIP for people with very long-term chronic conditions, sickness and disability. PIP, as it currently stands, doesn't work. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to fill out a PIP form. I've had to do that with loved ones. It will ask a question like, can you walk 200 metres? You can't. Maybe you can. If you have multiple sclerosis, you might be able to walk 200 metres. But what you can't then do is get out of bed for 2 days. So you score 0 on the PIP form, but actually, there is an opportunity cost to doing things. Somebody might be able to work part-time for 16 hours a week, but it would then mean they'd have no energy, time or health to enjoy the proceeds of that income. And the final thing I'd like to say, to the point about this being quite clearly politically toxic within the Labour movement and potentially with Labour voters or from the broad coalition that they managed to get together for July 2024. I think on the economics of it, it is not only difficult because, as I say, we need to spend money in the short term to realise the long-term gain, but doing this at the same time that you are bringing in increased national insurance contributions on employers, on the low-paid jobs that are the ones that are most likely to be the jobs that people coming off long-term benefit or with lower skills and education might hope to get. I think the culmination of those two things together is going to be incredibly difficult.
The Employment Rights Bill as well. I mean, that's Employment Rights Bill has made employing more risky. So the point of people taking a risk to take on someone who potentially hasn't had a long sort of career and work, or who may be sort of not able to work full time. The policies that the government have brought in the last 8 months has made hiring so much more difficult, so much more risky, and therefore the opportunities for actually people to return to work have disappeared.
Not even the employee rights stuff, just the increase to employees.
Well, and just before I come to you, I'll just get Nadia's response there. Do you agree with that?
No, absolutely not. The Employment Rights Bill does what... So part of the problem we're saying is that work doesn't pay, that too many people who are in work are having to claim benefits to subsidise their low wages. This bill, finally, for the first time in a generation, redresses the imbalance between employers and employees and gives workers rights from day one.
Nadia, that's
just let me finish. What we're saying is that on top of that, like, yes, it's good to do this, it's good to support people back into work, but cutting people's benefits does not help them.
Harriet?
Work is really important, and workers are vitally important for themselves, for the economy, for the country. But you don't have jobs and you don't have workers without employers. And the employers are being disincentivised for taking people into work because of the huge amount of cost and more responsibility that's being put on them. So there is no way in which employers are going to take a risk to increase the number of jobs that they have.
Right, let me just bring in. I'll come back to you, but let me.
If employers aren't hiring or they're freezing recruitment because they've been clobbered by Rachel Reeves's budget that has increased their employers' national insurance contributions, frozen their business rate relief, OK, and clobbered them in other ways, and they're not just not going to take people on. The other problem, and you raise a good point actually, Naomi, about the assessment. OK, the assessment by paperwork is not the way this should be assessed. I was staggered to read that when it comes to PIP assessments, 80% used to be carried out face-to-face before the pandemic.
Yes, and the Conservative governments didn't actually bring that back in terms of face-to-face assessments.
That number's gone down to 2%. Also, just on the moral case, you know, my late mother, God rest her soul, chronic alcoholic. We learn now that people who have got alcohol problems are being given PIP payments. I can tell you from personal experience, the only thing that PIP payment does is gives that alcoholic licence to go down to the off licence and buy more booze.
But was there other support available for her?
No, I'm saying that some of that money should be channelled, for instance, into addiction services. We have got a growth industry here. We have got sickfluencers online. It was quite right for Liz Kendall and Helen Whately to acknowledge that there are people now actively encouraging people to claim benefits that they should never have been entitled to. Of course you preserve the welfare state for those that really need it. People with disabilities and incapacities that mean that they aren't
and mental health conditions.
And some mental health conditions. But I still would question the wisdom of, for instance, and we have seen cases like this, it isn't made up, of providing PIP payments, and there's another argument about motability cars, to people suffering from ADHD, acne. That was not what this benefit system was designed to do.
Naomi?
We've now got this statistic on young people. This is staggering. The proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds classified as disabled has nearly doubled in the past decade, from 11% in 2030.
That we're living in,
but
though?
it cannot possibly be, Nadia.
So
There's a difference between. No, I'm saying that there's a massive difference.
Well, let Nadia respond to that, and I'll
claim
come to you, Naomi.
benefits and the actual rate of disability in this country doubling in a certain age range in a decade.
Naomi?
That would be medically incongruous.
Nadia,
you know how difficult it is to claim PIP? Not everybody who is disabled is eligible for PIP automatically. You have to go through an assessment. It's a very gruelling process. I don't know whether it's something that any of you have ever gone through, but I have, and it was horrible. What we need is to be supporting people who are the most vulnerable.
Agreed.
And this does not do that, because the PIP eligibility change means that people have to score 4 in one category under the daily activities assessment. So if you score a lower level across every category, then you still wouldn't be eligible for it. And I'll give you an example. If you need assistance to wash your hair, or your body below the waist, or supervision to go to the toilet, do you know what score that gives you?
0.
It's a 2.
No.
I'm not disagreeing with I totally agree with you that the people who are at most need should be getting this payment.
And will they still get it?
But do you think that are some people here gaming a system that has become open to abuse?
Do you think that's
incredibly dangerous to make that implication?
Well, let me get a final word. Let me get a final word from Naomi on that.
For every bit of anecdata about sickfluencers, there are plenty of examples, and people write to me daily about this, about their.
Of course, some people are gaming.
Exactly, that's the problem. You're not talking about real examples.
I'm saying, Nadia,
you're scaremongering.
No, I'm not scaremongering. I'm saying that we have to be able to identify that there are people in great need of PIP and others who are abusing the system, because we've actually got actual evidence.
Right, we're going to end it now, because we're going to discuss this after Prime Minister's questions. Let's just go into the chamber. We can see Jess Phillips there at the dispatch box. You can see filling up for Prime Minister's questions in just over 10 minutes' time. And as I say, we will discuss the issue of welfare I am sure, after Prime Minister's questions with our guests in that part of Politics Live. But let's talk about immigration. Let me show you this headline in the New York Times. How Trump's hardline tactics are driving down migration. Building on Biden-era policies, President Trump is strong-arming regional leaders, deploying military force and shredding decades of precedents when it comes to the US-Mexico border. Illegal crossings, according to the piece at the US-Mexico border, are down to their lowest level in decades. This headline in the BBC is reporting a story that the US deporting hundreds of Venezuelans despite court order. More than 200 Venezuelans alleged by the White House to be criminals have been deported to El Salvador. Let's talk to Julia Manchester from The Hill in Washington. Hello to you, Julia. What are the key immigration policies from President Trump that seem to be having this effect?
Good morning. So what we've seen is President Trump has really bolstered resources and Border Patrol presence at the U.S. southern border. You know, you mentioned border crossings from migrants or undocumented migrants were down, and we've seen that's, you know, it's really a drastic contrast between that and the Biden administration. During the month of February, for example, there were roughly just over 8,000 border crossings. Now, during the Biden administration, that was just for the month of February. But during the Biden administration, we would see that sometimes on a very busy day, 8,000 people could have crossed into the country illegally from the southern border within one day. So clearly, President Trump really cracking down on the situation at the southern border. But I think it goes beyond the southern border when it comes to President Trump's immigration policy. You know, in that kerfuffle he's had with the U.S. district judge this week over whether he has the authority to deport those 250 Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador. We've seen the president argue that this is on national security grounds. We've also seen the president really take aim in a way at many college campuses. You'll remember last year during those pro-Palestine Columbia University protests, the Trump administration seems to be targeting green card holders here in the United States who may have been arrested during those protests and essentially trying to detain or deport them. So President Trump cracking down on immigration on a number of fronts.
Right. So what has been the human cost of these policies? We've just seen some pictures of the Venezuelans particularly and how they've been treated as some of them have been deported. What is the human cost of these policies?
Well, you have seen a number of immigrant rights groups, human rights groups really push back on the Trump administration here, pointing to their treatment of migrants. You know, there's something called the Customs and Border Patrol Home app, the CPB app. And that was an application, you know, on an iPhone or a computer that a migrant could use to gain legal entry into the United States. And during the Biden administration, we saw that it was really used, it was a resource for these migrants and really kind of a point of hope in their journey to coming to the United States. But now that app under the Trump administration is being used to essentially get migrants to begin their journey back over the border. So I think there is certainly this feeling of depression, sadness among these migrants. But from the Trump administration's point of view, they say that this is needed.
All right, Julia Manchester in Washington, thank you very much. What do you make of what you've seen and heard in terms of how the UK should treat illegal immigration?
We still don't have safe and legal routes of passage, and that's what we need. If we want to tackle small boat crossings, etc., we need to be offering that safe and legal route and then massively speed up the processing within the Home Office. The backlogs are still too long, taking far too long. That is costing money that we can ill afford to absorb. The only way to tackle it, whether you are sympathetic or anti the plight of asylum seekers and refugees, if you're serious about getting the numbers down, you need the safe and legal routes. We don't yet have them.
Harriet?
Illegal immigration is a massive issue across the world. We've seen that, we've discussed it. I've discussed it here with you before, and we've been discussing it for many years. The key thing that we need, and I think which Donald Trump, President Trump was demonstrating there, is the need of a deterrent, because a deterrent is one way in which we can ensure that people are less likely to take their life into their own hands in many cases, to cross the channel or cross into other countries. We need to make sure that people know that if they come to the UK or any other country, but in our case the UK illegally, they will not be able to stay if they do not have a right to be here. If they've come here illegally, they will not be able to stay, full stop, because we need to stop the illegal trade in humans across the Channel, across the rest of the world, and a deterrent is the key way we can do that.
Is that the way to go?
It doesn't work because if you look at it like this, the ultimate deterrent really is death, isn't it? People are risking their lives to cross the Channel.
Although many of them do still take that huge risk.
Well, that's exactly my point. And people are still doing that. And that's because the push factors that are causing people to make those journeys, fleeing war, persecution, poverty, are still in place. So what we need, Naomi is absolutely right, we need safe and legal routes. That's what all charities and experts are calling for, and we need to speed up processing
and then when they're
claims.
processed, if they pass the assessment and they are a legitimate refugee that requires asylum, they stay, and if they don't and they are an illegal immigrant, then they are sent home.
And the
But at
vast
the moment,
majority are legitimate.
Camilla?
When we have safe and legal routes, do we put any cap on the numbers of people that we can accept into the UK? Just in terms of the survival of the infrastructure of the UK, how many schools we have, how many doctors and dentists we have, how many hospitals, how many houses we have, not least with burgeoning waiting lists of people already on lists for social housing. So how do we control the numbers if we have safe and legal routes, out of interest?
Well, there would still be controls there.
Oh, so you put a cap on the number of people coming in?
Well, it would be decided on a case-by-case basis in the same way.
Surely you have to at some point say...
If you ask me a question, do you want to just let me finish?
Just a straight answer. Would we put a cap on numbers?
I wouldn't, no.
Right, so...
But what I'm talking about with safe and legal routes, this isn't an open borders policy.
Sounds like it.
Well, except the numbers, of course, under previous Conservative governments were a good
routes. Under
how many more should we
for
have?
Ukrainians?
Yeah, no. So there were caps,
for example, and we know
okay, so
that
that's an
works.
example.
Don't interrupt.
Where there was
Try not to cross over each other, Nadia.
We know that safe and legal routes work because Ukrainians aren't crossing the Channel, are they? Because they have safe and legal routes to get here.
There was a cap on the numbers.
Hang on.
I am saying that we should extend those safe and legal routes to other people who are desperate and who are risking their lives.
And I am
that is how we stop people risking their lives on the Channel.
And through foreign aid, and through tackling climate change.
I can see that you're finding this very
of mass displacement of people. The very people that often say they don't want immigration, who are concerned about particularly what they call illegal immigration, are often the very same people who call for foreign aid cuts, who don't want to tackle the climate crisis that we've got in front of us, all the reasons that are causing the huge mass displacement of people and an increasing number because of climate change.
Sorry, I'm not
over
asking a complicated
decades.
question. I totally understand the argument for
Which
safe
bit don't you get?
and legal routes. The bit I don't get is your inability to give me an answer to whether there should be a cap. When we said we would take Ukrainians, we put a cap on it. When we said we would take people from Hong Kong, we put a cap on it. I asked you whether you would put a cap on numbers, purely because if you have other safe and legal routes, and we feel that the infrastructure of this country might suffer, and not least if people are already waiting on housing lists, that they will be bumped down them if we let everybody into this country.
Well, hang on, Camilla.
I'm really
there's
asking
one question,
number
but there's one question for you on safe and legal routes. Do you think if there were more safe and legal routes, there would be fewer people trying to cross the Channel?
Yeah, of course there would be.
Right. So you agree with safe and legal routes?
Legal routes and a cap if you want.
We can have safe and legal routes,
So
but I think you have
legal routes.
Caps don't work.
Hallelujah.
Caps
right,
don't work.
well,
Theresa May said we need to
But you
reduce
have to totally.
net
You have to
migration
put a
by
number on
to
it,
100,000.
yeah.
Well, hang on.
But the numbers never get capped.
Hang on.
They don't work.
The Conservatives have put numbers.
The
The Conservatives have put numbers, I have to say, on legal migration and have never reached tens of thousands. Do you still think a number is worthwhile having on an annual cap? This is broadly on immigration because Kemi Badenoch still hasn't come up with one.
We recognise that the tens of thousands was not reached. But if you don't have a cap, if you don't have a number to work to, how do you hold yourself to account? How can you, for example, come and question me about us not reaching our target?
But you breached it for 14 years.
But there is an accountability there, and it's something to work to. If you shoot into the dark, i.e. just be like, we will take anyone who comes via whatever route, then how can you control that? How can you manage? How can we say that, for example, infrastructure is going to keep up? You spoke about the foreign aid budget, but so much of that budget is spent on asylum hotels. So this whole thing is such a mess of every straw being pulled has an impact elsewhere. But none of these things are adding up easily. We need to have a robust deterrent in order to stop people coming
But the
here
deterrent that was
who cannot
tried
come
by previous Conservative governments never came into operation.
No,
and
it
that
didn't,
was
because
the
Labour
Rwanda scheme, and it seemed impossible for the governments to actually enact it in the first place. There is an ongoing discussion within the Conservative Party about whether Britain should ignore the judges. We heard there Donald Trump obviously ignoring court orders when it comes to deporting Venezuelans. Do you think Britain should ignore judges when it comes to these sorts of cases?
The most important thing is that we in Britain can control our borders, control our sovereignty, and have control over who is coming to the country. And who is important, because some of the names of people
you've always
we
had
see,
control.
Some of the names of
over
people
who
we
can come.
see coming across the channel are people we do not want here and must be able to deport in order to keep our country safe, our borders safe. And if that means also, you don't agree?
Well, finish your point, and then I come to Nadia. Yeah.
I think it's really important that we can control who's coming here. And if that means that we need to look away from what international courts are telling us versus what we're actually able to control here, then that is something that we need to consider.
All right, because that is what Chris
President of the United States is a convicted felon, so let's not be surprised
Having
if
said
he
that,
flouts
the one
a court
president,
order.
the one president who deported more illegal immigrants than any over the course of the last 15 years is President Obama.
Yeah, well,
far more than Trump's first term in office, 2.9 million versus 2.2.
But where would you put a cap, Camilla? Which countries would you put a cap on in terms of safe and legal routes? There wasn't a cap. There wasn't a cap for Ukrainians.
No, there wasn't a cap for Ukrainians, but there was for the Hong Kongers.
There might have been longer. There wasn't a cap for the number of Ukrainians.
I think people, generally the British people, are extremely welcoming to people who are fleeing persecution. But I think equally the British public are extremely concerned that unfortunately we do not have the housing and the infrastructure to cope with safe and legal folk. Well, successive governments, Nadia, including your own, unfortunately.
We're in for Prime Minister's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night I spoke to President Zelensky to discuss progress that President Trump had made with Russia towards a ceasefire, and I took the opportunity to reaffirm our unwavering support to the people of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply concerned about the resumption of Israeli military action in Gaza. The images of parents carrying their children, young children, to hospitals have emerged over the last few days are truly shocking, alongside the sheer number of people who've been killed. And we will do all that we can to ensure the resumption of the ceasefire, to get the remaining hostages out and to get aid that's desperately needed in. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to celebrate the extraordinary life of Group Captain John Paddy Hemingway, the last known pilot of the Battle of Britain. The courage of his generation, the fearlessness, sense of duty and service secured our freedom, and we will never forget them. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Alberto Costa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brain tumours kill more children and those under the age of 40 than any other cancer. Mr. Speaker, from time to time, all of us get constituents in our surgeries that tell us stories which really get to us and twang on the heart. Mr. Speaker, last Friday, Laura attended my Shanford constituency. She told me of the tragic death of her 6-year-old, energetic, loving son, Talon, from a brain tumour. All that she asked, Mr. Speaker, is that I raise this matter nationally, and I'm doing that now. But I'd like to go one step further. Would the Prime Minister agree to arrange a meeting for Laura and the brain tumour support group known as Angel Mums to meet with the relevant healthcare minister to discuss brain tumour research?
Prime Minister. Can I thank him for doing what he was asked to do, which is raising this case here. The loss of a child is simply unbearable, and I think most of us, including myself, simply wouldn't know how we would be able to react. And I think the whole House will want to send its deepest condolences to Laura and to all of Talon's family and friends. I will happily make sure that the meeting that he requests takes place, so we can reassure that we are committed to supporting life-saving and life-improving research and doing all we can to improve how we prevent, detect manage and treat cancer. Thank you.
Andrew Pex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many people in Peterborough, I am passionate about tackling low pay and insecure work, especially for young people. Next month, many of my constituents will receive a welcome boost in their pay packets due to the increase in the national minimum wage delivered by the government. Can I thank the Prime Minister for ignoring the voices on the opposite benches who continue to oppose our plans to make work pay? And can I urge him to go further and faster in delivering our plan for change for working people?
Well, I thank him. He's a superb job for Peterborough, and we're proud that our Employment Rights Bill is tackling the cost of insecure work, and we're delivering that pay rise for 3 million of the lowest paid. We know the Leader of the Opposition opposes all that. She thinks the minimum wage is a burden and that maternity pay is excessive. It's the same old Tories. They opposed the minimum wage in the first place. They've learned absolutely nothing.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Beryl.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor claimed that her budget was a once-in-a-Parliament reset. So why are we having an emergency budget next week?
Mr. Speaker, we have delivered record investment into this country. We've had 3 interest rates cut in a row, and wages are going up faster than prices, which is a massive cost of living boost. That's after only 8 months, after 14 years of absolute failure. What do they do? Interest rates 11%. Massive 22 million black hole in the economy. They crashed the economy. We're rebuilding Britain.
Mr. Speaker, he knows why we're having an emergency budget, because since the last one, since the Chancellor delivered her budget in October, growth is down, borrowing is up, and she has destroyed business confidence. Does the Prime Minister now regret raising taxes on business?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the OBR will present their numbers. There'll be a spring statement next week. But, Mr. Speaker, she still hasn't. We've got record investment into this country. Interest rates have been cut, and she talks about national insurance. We had to fill the 22 billion black hole that lay there. We've invested in the NHS, in schools and public services. We're pressing on with planning, with infrastructure and regulation. But I understand the Leader of the Opposition is straight talking, so perhaps she can help us with this. Is she going to reverse the next increase? If not, what's the point? If so, what other taxes is she raising to fill the hole? One way or the other.
You're in government. Speaker, the only black hole is the one that he is digging. He's shown absolutely no regret, but everybody knows the Chancellor has made a mistake. That is why they're having an emergency budget. Later today, Conservatives will vote to exempt hospices, pharmacies and care providers from her national insurance rise. Will he, at the very least, support exempting these vulnerable services from his jobs tax?
Prime Minister.
I noticed she didn't say they're going to reverse the national insurance rises. It's exactly what she wants all the benefits, but they can't say how they're going to pay them. She carps from the sideline, but can't make her mind up whether she supports or doesn't support national insurance rises. We've made provision for hospices, we've made provisions for charities, but we had to secure the economy. We had to fill the £22 billion black hole that they disgracefully left.
Mr. Speaker, he hasn't made these provisions. He keeps talking about budget benefits. Unemployment is not a benefit. Businesses closing are not benefits. I asked him whether he would exempt hospices, even children's hospices, from the jobs tax. He did not answer that question. His MPs know that this could affect end-of-life care. So I will ask the same question again. Will he exempt hospices from paying his jobs tax?
Mr. Speaker, we've already invested £100 million for adult and children's hospices. an additional £26 million in funding through the Children's Hospices grant, but we can't get away with what we were doing in that budget, the root cause, which was fixing the economy they left so badly damaged, a £22 billion black hole. Perhaps you start the next question with an apology.
Mr. Speaker, I remember when he made... They want me to answer questions, then we can swap sides. I remember when he made that announcement. He's forgotten, because the money he's referring to for hospices is for buildings. It is not for the salaries hit by the jobs tax. As St Helena Hospice in Colchester said, we cannot use this funding for salaries, which is where we need urgent help. Why is the Prime Minister not listening to hospices?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I've already set out the position in relation to hospices. She says that she wants to swap sides. I mean, heaven forbid. After 14 years of breaking everything, we're getting on with the job of fixing it, and all she can do is cart from the sidelines with absolutely no policy.
Mr. Speaker, winter fuel payments have been snatched. The jobs tax is hammering everyone from business to charities. The Chancellor promised a once-in-a-Parliament budget that she would not come back for more. And in that budget, she said there will be no extension of the freeze in income tax thresholds. Ahead of the emergency budget, will he repeat? Mr. Speaker, ahead of the emergency budget, will he repeat the commitment that she made?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she's got such prescriptive questions, she can't actually adapt them to the answers that I'm giving. I mean, Mr. Speaker, I think she now calls herself a Conservative realist. Well, I'm realistic about the Conservatives. The reality is they left open borders and she was the cheerleader. They crashed the economy, mortgages went through the roof. The NHS was left on its knees and they hollowed out the armed forces. This government has already delivered 2 million extra NHS appointments, 750 breakfast clubs, record returns of people who shouldn't be here, and a fully funded increase in our defence spending. That is the difference that a Labour government makes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lady came to see me recently who needed help. She had a disability. It meant that her children have to help her cut up her food. They have to help her wash beneath the waist. They have to supervise her as she goes to the toilet. Under the Tory welfare system, we were able to get that lady on PIP. Under the Prime Minister's new proposed system, she will get zero, nothing. And after 14 years of the Tory government, and many of us wanting to see the back of them, can the Prime Minister answer one question? What was the point if Labour are going to do this?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've lived with the impact of a disability in our family through my mother and brother all my life. I do understand the human impact of this, but the current system is morally and economically indefensible, and we're right to reform it, and nobody should be defending the broken status quo. We are proceeding on three principles: that if you can work, you should work. If you need help into work, the state should help you, not hinder you. And if you can never work, you must be supported and protected. They are the right principles, but we can't leave the current system as it is.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks on Ukraine and Gaza? And can I also pay tribute to Group Captain John Paddy Hemingway and all our heroes from the Battle of Britain? I know that members across this House will, like me, have heard from GPs, dentists, community pharmacists and care homes who are all deeply worried about the impact of the national insurance rise on the services they provide to patients. That's why the House of Lords passed a Liberal Democrat amendment to exempt NHS and care providers. That amendment comes before this House this afternoon, but we're hearing worrying reports that the Prime Minister will order Labour MPs to vote against it. Will the Prime Minister reassure this House and patients across the country that these reports are not true?
Prime Minister.
Can I start by pointing out that because of the changes we made at that budget, we were able to put record amounts of money into our National Health Service, and vitally important that we did so. And it isn't right to simply oppose the measures we had to take to raise the money and at the same time say, as the Honourable Gentleman does, that he wants the benefits of the increase in funding to the NHS. The two can't sit together. We have already invested an additional £3.7 billion of funding into social care, including £880 million to increase the social care grant. So we are taking steps. But the basic point remains, which is we can't make the investment into the NHS if we don't raise the money. And you can't simply oppose any raising of money and at the same time welcome the money into the NHS.
Sir Davey.
That reply, and I hope he and the Chancellor will think about taking money from the NHS ahead of the spring statement and reverse it. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to turn to the issue of illegal hair coursing. Criminal gangs are terrorising rural communities across our country, from Cambridgeshire to Devon, from Oxfordshire to Wiltshire. Men in balaclavas are threatening and abusing farmers as these criminals tear across their fields in 4x4s. Farmers are warning that it's only a matter of time before someone is killed. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that we must act urgently against this appalling criminality? And will he back our calls for a comprehensive rural crime strategy so we can not just stamp out hair coursing, but keep our rural communities safe from all crime?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this important issue, and it is a matter of deep concern. We've already developing a rural crime strategy, but we'll happily work with him and others to develop it further.
Maurice Turner.
Northfield are deeply concerned about the scourge of knife crime, and I pay tribute to the professionalism of West Midlands Police for their response to these horrendous attacks. But there are still 1,200 fewer police officers and PCSOs in the force than in 2010. A new bid has been submitted to the Home Office for 150 more officers. Will he look at this issue so that the police can do more to keep our streets secure and safe?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I join him in commending the West Midlands Police for keeping his community safe? We are doubling our investment to £200 million towards the recruitment of 13,000 neighbourhood police, giving every community a named officer to help tackle violent crime. And we're currently working through bids with forces to ensure that we do so, and I'll make sure he gets a meeting with the relevant policing minister to discuss.
Conor Denyer.
Mr. Speaker, we have a deeply unfair, unequal economic system where vast numbers of people are struggling, yet billionaires are getting richer and richer. Does the Prime Minister really think that the way to tackle this is to put the onus onto older people, children, and now sick and disabled people, rather than on the shoulders of the super rich with a wealth tax, those people who could most easily afford to pay? And if the Prime Minister uses the phrase difficult choices in his answer, please will he specify difficult choices for whom?
Well,
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we do have a proportional tax system, and we have raised tax on the wealthiest under this government. But her advice would count for a bit more if their manifesto hadn't been a recipe for £80 billion of extra borrowing. That is to do exactly what Liz Truss did to the economy, and that doesn't help any of the people that she's claiming to support.
Mohammed Yazid.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the government's ambitious growth plans for Oxford-Cambridge Arc, which promises to reverse years of decline and transform the eastern region by driving prosperity, creating jobs, and delivering much-needed housing. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that the crowning achievement of this plan would be the establishment of a world-class theme park in Bedford Borough? It would transform our local economy, create thousands of new jobs and opportunities, and elevate Bedford as a national hub for leisure and tourism.
Prime Minister.
Well, he's right to raise this important project, which we are working for. And it's vital that we do unleash the potential of the Oxford-Cambridge corridor and, of course, Bedford by generating growth, jobs and opportunities. And we're doing that by speeding up the delivery of new infrastructure projects, slashing red tape and getting Britain building.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents have approached me about the inadequate treatment of young people's eating disorders. This year, despite a 30% increase in referrals, the majority of ICBs have cut real-term funding. Currently, as I've seen in my own family and my weekly surgeries, those who reach out for treatment are told, in effect, come back when you're thinner, increasing both the human and financial costs of treatment. Does the Prime Minister agree timely intervention is critical, and will he meet with me to discuss how we fund it?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Well, he's right. Too many people with eating disorders are not getting the treatment that they need. The NHS is expanding eating disorder treatment services with a focus on accessing treatment earlier and closer to home. And we're also providing access to specialist mental health professionals in every school. And I'll make sure that he's kept updated.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour's flagship crime and policing bill is designed to tackle the rise in antisocial behaviour, theft and shoplifting that has occurred under the Tories. It grants police the power to confiscate disruptive off-road vehicles. This measure will tackle the scourge of off-road bikes in my constituency. Does the Prime Minister agree that we are the party of law and order and that we are fulfilling our commitments?
Mr. Speaker, it's totally unacceptable for anyone to feel intimidated or unsafe due to the actions of reckless and selfish individuals. Whatever the vehicle, our bill gives police forces stronger powers to seize them immediately and put a stop to antisocial behaviour. That's our plan for change in action, making our streets and communities safer.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 14 years to get ready, they came into power with no plan to reform welfare. But now, in a panic because of their economic mismanagement, they're cutting benefits for disabled people without consulting them at all. It probably says in his folder that the High Court ruled the Conservatives' consultation was too short, but at least we consulted. They're not consulting at all. So will the Prime Minister explain why he is doing things to disabled people and not with them?
No, what it says in my favour is they had 14 years, including five with a majority of... They didn't need to consult, get on with it. They had a majority of 80 for the last 5 years. They're now carping on with some of their ideas. 14 years, and they didn't implement a single one. They simply broke the system. They're in no place to lecture other people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the charity Shelter, there are more homeless children in my city of Edinburgh than there are in the whole of Wales. That's an appalling legacy of 18 years of SNP government. Does the Prime Minister agree with me there should be no homeless children? And will he work with me, the Scottish Parliament and anyone who'll listen to end child homelessness in Scotland?
Well, the situation he describes an appalling indictment of the SNP record. The party opposite left record homelessness in England. The SNP record is equally shameful, a record number of children in temporary accommodation. Mr. Speaker, we're investing £1 billion to tackle homelessness, we're abolishing no-fault evictions and building 1.5 million new homes. Meanwhile, the SNP have cut their affordable housing budget. They've had the largest settlement since devolution. They've got the power, the money. Now it's time they started delivering.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, I received an email from Santander informing me that both the Bognor Regis and the Rustlington branches in my constituency are set to close, with 4 other bank branches shutting across the constituency in 2023 alone. The most vulnerable members of our society are being gradually cut off from essential banking services. Small cash-based businesses will also struggle to deposit their takings, faced with the added burden of travelling to Chichester or Worthing, making it even harder for them to operate. So what decisive action is the Prime Minister taking to guarantee that people and businesses in my constituency and across the country are not left without access to cash and vital banking services?
Mr. Speaker, we are rolling out 350 banking hubs across all communities, and I'll happily arrange for her to have a meeting with the Minister to discuss how that might affect her constituency.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Firstly, I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement of £200 million from the National Wealth Fund for the industrial future of Grangemouth. But today, I want to ask specifically about the workers facing redundancy. Given the assurances from the Prime Minister on the 18th of February and repeated by Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, as recently as the 4th of March, can the Prime Minister confirm that the guarantee given on 18 months pay protection for all of those workers losing their jobs due to the Grangemouth refinery closure will be honoured, including those shared services workers, and say how the payment can be claimed by all those affected?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, Petroenius have said that every employee made redundant will get 18 months full pay. The Project Willow report that's come out today says how we can support a sustainable industrial future for Grangemouth, which is incredibly important, delivering jobs and economic growth. As he references, I've announced £200 million through the National Wealth Fund to secure the site's long-term future. And of course, that's backed by the £100 million Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal, which is training and the training guarantee to support workers into good jobs. They're all the actions that we were taking on this very, very important issue.
Nick Timothy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the House of Lords considers the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme regulations, which diverge from the proposals of the inquiry report and the government response. The regulations introduce new exclusions, treat victims inconsistently, and downgrade some previously agreed awards, such as that to my constituent Owen Saville. Will the Prime Minister remember the promise made to victims like Owen and think again?
Well, the victims of this scandal have suffered unspeakably, and I'm pleased that at the budget we set aside the £11.8 billion to compensate them in relation to this appalling scandal. I would gently point out that the party opposite was committed rightly to this compensation, but didn't provide a single penny in the column to pay for it. The Infected Blood Compensation Authority has been established and began to make payments last year. Over £1 billion interim payments have been made, and we do remain completely committed to cooperating with the inquiry and acting on its recommendations.
Elise Midgley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone is talking about Adolescence, the series by Knowsley's own Stephen Graham and Christine Tamarco. It highlights online male radicalisation and violence against girls. The creators of the show are calling for screenings in Parliament and schools to spark change. So will the Prime Minister back this campaign to counter toxic misogyny early and give young men the role models they deserve?
Yeah. Prime Minister. Yes, and at home we are watching Adolescence with our children. I've got a 16-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl, and it's a very, very good documentary to watch, or drama. This violence carried out by young men, influenced by what they see online, is a real problem. It's abhorrent, and we have to tackle it. We are putting in specialist rape and sexual offences teams in every police force, doing work on the 999 calls. But this is also a matter of culture that I think it's important that across the whole House we tackle this emerging and growing problem.
Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Democrats have long called for a UK-EU youth mobility scheme, and polling has repeatedly shown that the majority of Brits support this idea, including my constituents in Epsom and Ewell. A well-structured and controlled scheme would show that the government is serious about providing opportunities for young people and backing British business. So will the Prime Minister stop sitting on the fence and finally commit to a youth mobility scheme?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are working closely with our European colleagues and the EU in particular, and we are working to a reset of the relationship. We won't be returning to freedom of movement. I've made that repeatedly clear, but we're making good progress.
Oral Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous government failed to properly support further and adult education over the last 14 years. And in contrast, the Prime Minister's personal commitment to technical qualifications has been encouraging. Last year's budget provided a welcome boost to some parts of the sector, but need and demand is outstripping available funding. Skills are crucial to the government meeting its missions to deliver economic growth, build 1.5 million homes, and to transition to a green economy. Can the Prime Minister provide reassurance that the funding model will be reviewed so that we won't see colleges having to turn people away who want to gain the skills that our country so desperately needs?
Prime Minister.
Well, she's right. Further education plays a critical role in giving young people the skills and confidence that they need, and of course the training we need for the future. We are investing £400 million on education for 16 to 19-year-olds this year, and our levy-funded growth and skills offer will create jobs in key industries, and I can assure her that the funding will deliver enough places for young people.
John Cooper.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Large spending announcements for defence would make you think that Britain is marching us to war, but the MOD is bimbling along with procurement systems better designed for peacetime. Will the Prime Minister use his good offices to bring British industry into this fight, and quickly?
Prime Minister.
Yes, but they did leave a bit of a mess that we are clearing up, having hollowed out our armed forces and having not made the necessary investment that we needed in our defence. We've announced the largest sustained increase since the Cold War of 2.5% by 2027 and 3% in the next Parliament, subject to economic circumstances. So yes, we are getting on with the job and clearing up the mess that they left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency, Stratford and Bow, has the greatest number of high-rise buildings with dangerous cladding in the country. On Friday, I visited Stratford Fire Station. Our brilliant local firefighters told me that 77 high-rise buildings in Newham and 165 high-rise buildings in Tower Hamlets are covered in hazardous materials, many of them deemed unsafe. Thousands of my constituents have been calling for justice for years. Can the Prime Minister tell me what the government is doing to ensure that private developers are held to account for the dangerous cladding on the high-rises that they have built?
Prime Minister.
Well, she's right. Remediation has been far too slow, and everybody deserves a safe and secure home. We've signed a contract with 54 major developers who will pay for or fix over 1,700 buildings, and we're accelerating that progress. We will take tough action against those who evade their responsibilities. We will recover taxpayers' funds and make sure those responsible pay up and fix unsafe buildings quickly.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come to this chamber, Mr. Speaker, every week to ask sensible questions, and I expect sensible answers. But all I get is glazed expressions and waffle from the opposite benches. So Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Prime Minister a very simple question on behalf of all the net zero sceptics. If we became net zero tomorrow, by how much would it reduce the Earth's temperature by? Simple question.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, net zero is of course not easy, but it's a huge opportunity to boost our growth, our jobs and our economy. And so he knows my views on that. But you know, he complains that our better ideas if they stop fawning over Putin. And I understand the member for Clacton wants to be Prime Minister. He can't even lead a party that fits in the back of a taxi.
Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 5 disabled people in social housing and 1 in 3 disabled private renters live in inaccessible housing. One of my constituents with severe fibromyalgia and PTSD lives on a first-floor flat with no lift access. As we build the 1.5 million new homes that this country needs, will the Prime Minister ensure that they are built to be accessible and adaptable so disabled and older people can live independently for generations to come?
Prime Minister.
She's right. Everybody needs to be able to access a home that is suitable for them and meets their needs. The planning rules, Mr. Speaker, already mean councils must consider the needs of disabled people when planning new homes. We will go further, setting out our policies on accessible new homes very shortly, and we're boosting the Disabled Facilities Grant by £172 million, helping more people make vital improvements and live independent lives.
Lee Dillon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite Ukraine being the victim in Russia's illegal aggression, President Zelensky has shown leadership to his people by committing to the US plans for a ceasefire. However, it's clear that Putin is playing for time and still carrying out daily attacks on Ukrainian people. So, Prime Minister, is now not the time to take those frozen Russian assets, to seize them, to give them to the Ukrainian people, to strengthen their hand at the negotiating table and to punish Russian aggression?
Minister.
Well, on both points, I spoke to President Zelensky last night following the discussions yesterday to discuss the way forward. On the wider question of the assets, look, it's complicated, but we're working with others to see what is possible, but it isn't straightforward.
Ewan Steinback.
Mr. Speaker, the release of Project Willow today is a step forward in securing good jobs and an industrial future for Grangemouth. However, the Government needs to work at pace to ensure the recommendations in Willow are acted upon. Can the Prime Minister outline what steps he will be taking to ensure barriers to a rapid transition at Grangemouth are removed and investment is progressed as quickly as possible?
Well, I'm very grateful for him for raising Grangemouth again the second time in this session, and that's because it's centrally important. He'll have heard what I had to say about the projects that we're looking at to ensure the long-term future of Grangemouth, the interim measures that are being taken, and of course the £200 million of the Wealth Fund that I announced just a few weeks ago.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at this point and bring you any important developments that happen. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Torsten Bell, Pensions Minister. Helen Whately for the Opposition, for the Conservatives, Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. You'll have seen her yesterday in the House responding to Liz Kendall. And Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor. Welcome to all of you. Kemi Badenoch targeted her questions, Chris, on what she called an emergency budget to respond to the jobs tax that she says was Labour's mistake last year in the budget in October to increase national insurance contributions on employers. Interesting that she hasn't said that she would actually support reversing that, but we'll leave that there just for the moment. Give us the context of the fact that we're a week away from this statement that we are now expecting from the Chancellor.
Yeah, so we had all the focus that we in the build-up to yesterday and the announcement around benefits. The focus now tilts towards a week today. And what's intriguing about this as a moment is that it has grown in political significance and indeed the kind of names that are being attached to it. I mean, I think way back last autumn, it may not have even qualified for sort of proper noun capital letters in terms of how it was being described as a moment. It was going to be an update from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent watchdog, and not much more. And the government was trying to make a virtue at the time about having a single quote-unquote fiscal event, to use the Westminster vernacular, because that was seen to be sort of more stable than a process that you get to every 6 months with all of the build-up and the reaction afterwards. It's grown in political significance because a lot has happened in the last 6 months. The financial picture is more bleak than it looked then. Obviously, the international picture is very turbulent. And the Conservatives are having rather a lot of fun about putting their own name upon next week, labelling it as an emergency budget. One thing just to tease out from PMQs, which is interesting and the Conservatives have seized on instantly, was the exchange around the prospect of the thresholds for taxes, which have been frozen for a long time. People see that as something of a stealth tax, people being drawn into tax bands that they previously weren't in.
And they're going to be unfrozen, of course, we were told, in 2028.
Indeed. So it is being pointed out, in fact, the very column of Hansard is being pointed to from October of last year, when Rachel Reeves suggested that towards the end of this Parliament there would be an unfreezing of those thresholds. that in a question and the exchange between Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister didn't suggest or didn't rule out the idea that they may be frozen further. So that is being seized upon. You wouldn't expect him to announce in PMQs some sort of tax measure
But it
that
has
may or may
been
not
talked
come.
about, hasn't it?
But it's a straw in the wind that the opposition are seizing upon.
Just before we move on, since Chris has raised this issue of what we should call next week's statement, let me ask you, Torsten Bell, is it an emergency budget? Is it a spring statement? Is it a spring forecast? What is it?
I thought it was bold of Kemi Badenoch to try to say that it was an emergency budget, because there's only been one emergency budget in most of our recent political memory, and that was Liz Truss in September 2022.
All right, so it's not an emergency.
That's what an emergency budget looks like.
It? Because Rachel Reeves said she wouldn't need to come back and go to the dispatch box and give a full response in the way she clearly is now going to those forecasts.
Well, look, as Chris says, you'll see what is delivered next week, but she'll be delivering a spring statement, which was what she always intended.
Right. Well, let's go to our economics editor, Faisal Islam, because what we are talking about here is Rachel Reeves's response next week in order to, we use the phrase, balance the books. Savings were going to be made from welfare. Is that what yesterday's changes were about? They were about savings rather than a moral mission, which is what the government have called it.
Yes, Joe. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of talk about fixing the broken welfare system. You'll hear that a lot from the minister beside you. I think if you look through all of this, the main impetus seems to be to save that money and to book it next week at that spring statement forecast, call it whatever you want. And you can see that because certain policies are being consulted on, so they won't count in the OBR's forecast because they're not certain. Certain policies are not being consulted on, and it looks like those are the ones that save you money. I think it's interesting to note that we haven't got the full colour on exactly where the savings come from. We think they come predominantly from the PIP change. But for example, we've talked a lot about anxious viewers, listeners and readers. They want to know how many people are affected and what's the average impact. So I have been saying several 100,000 will be hit by thousands of pounds. Now, the government will know exactly who they are. They'll have gone through that kind of now quite famous PIP questionnaire where the different points for different things, and they'll have literally set, I think, the number in order to get the savings, and we'll have to get the OBR to certificate that. Now, this is really important, and I think there are bigger topics here, Joe, about exactly what are they trying to achieve that they're willing to tell you about. Are they, in fact, trying to roll back this rapid rise in mental health applications that we've seen, and successful applications? I think we see a chart now of the increase in cost in cash terms. This is the terms in which the government are referring, and it goes up in cash, and there's some argument for actually using a real number, but this is the number that the government using. It goes up to 70 billion. That was the plan, and I think what this does is take that down to 65 billion, which has raised another important question, which is, are the savings coming from people who in the future would have got it, who won't get it, or, as seems to be inevitable, it will affect current recipients as well? So these are important details, but there's a broader point here, which is, do they think that this rise in mental health applications is not what the point of the incapacity system was for? Built up for physical disabilities was, for example, the PIP form designed really for physical. Do they row back, for example, on this parity of esteem between mental and physical disability, which was such a big part of the policy agenda for 10 years, because they feel people are claiming too much benefit?
Well, let's take the £5 billion pounds of savings that the government says it will make from the proposals and the changes. And I take your point, and we'll put that question to the Minister afterwards about the parity of mental health conditions and physical health conditions. But does it all solve Rachel Reeves's problems ahead of next week's statement?
From what we understand of the numbers, it about half solves it. So there was £10 billion of room for manoeuvre. That was quite tight at the budget. And our understanding that because of rises in government interest rates and also changes in growth rates, some of that comes from abroad, some of that's domestically generated, that's been wiped out more or less. We don't know for certain. It's the OBR that knows that. This does £5 billion. You'd expect another few billion, probably from a tweak to the government spending sort of assumption behind the spending review. Perhaps some other more solid cuts. We've heard already about the NHS England being cut. That's thousands of jobs. That could be that will be a saving, and also these efficiency drives. So I think there's still more cuts to come. But also very interesting to see this OBR process, because you take the PIP cut. There is now a huge incentive upon people to claim the more severe route to carry on claiming PIP and also universal credit. So there's a behavioural response which the OBR will judge about just how much money this will save.
Thank you very much, Faisal. And of course, you'll be joining me here, I hope, in the studio for whatever we want to call it, that spring statement, forecast, emergency budget next week. And so will you, Chris. Well, I've marked your cards now. You have to turn up, both of you. Torsten Bell, more cuts to come. Because the figures won't add up. So we can expect more cuts to welfare down the line, or perhaps to other unprotected departments.
Well, I haven't been a minister or a politician for very long, but I'm not an idiot. So I'm obviously not going to preempt the Chancellor's statement next week. She'll set that out in the usual way, setting out the forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility and her response to that. So I know it's hard. We will have to wait a few more days.
Right, but you say that you haven't been a minister for long, but we've just heard that the money, and we don't yet know because we haven't seen an impact assessment of how many people go back into work, etc. But we know that even if it raises £5 billion, it's not enough for Rachel Reeves in terms of balancing the books by 29-30. So there will have to be more cuts. She doesn't want to break her fiscal rules. She said that she's not going to increase taxes. There'll be more cuts.
No, look, what we said in our manifesto was that the welfare system needed to be reformed, and that's what we set out yesterday. That is what yesterday is about. Some of us have been writing about that for years, that we've built a welfare system that didn't offer people support to go into work, which is why we've ended up with 2.8 million people out of work, 1 million people NEET, 1 million young people who are NEET. 1 in 8 young people
not in
education,
employment or training.
That is a disaster, and we're putting that right. £1 billion to make sure people can get support on a pathway to work. For some people, that won't be work. It will be volunteering. It'll be support to get out of the house.
Yeah.
But we do need that reform, yes.
Right, so nothing to do with savings.
No, look, we've said, particularly for PIP, that if we want a system to be there to support those who need it most, then it needs to be sustainable, and that's what we've set out, some difficult choices, yes, on yesterday. But as the Secretary of State said in the House of Commons yesterday, the total number of people still receiving PIP yet will still be rising. That's why some people are attacking us for...
Yes. Well, some people, this is probably where Helen comes in, because it's true. It's still going to go up, the welfare bill. It's just going to rise more slowly. But at least this government's grappled it, which is what previous Conservative governments failed to do.
So we did take a grip on welfare, but I will very happily come to that and what we did. But on a reflection on what the government announced yesterday, I think is fundamentally that they have got this very wrong. There was a very important moment where the government needed to seize, and we need welfare reforms. There are too many people claiming benefits, over 7 million people now, and the bill is forecast to rise to over 100 billion. So actually, for the sake of the country's finances and for the sake of the many people who are shut out of work and on sickness benefits, and that's over 2.8 million people at the moment, that needed to be reformed. We were working on reforms and the election came. What was announced yesterday included a re-announcement of some of those reforms, but actually I'm afraid there's two things. One is it didn't go far enough on making savings and reforms. And on the other hand, it actually has frightened a lot of disabled people, because actually there are people who are severely and seriously disabled who do need the support of the welfare system. And this is where I think the government's got it wrong on both fronts, in fact.
Torsten?
Well, look, I'm afraid the Conservatives created this problem. The number of people who are claiming incapacity and disability benefits is rising faster than the level of disability and ill health in our society, which is also far too high, because we've got to sort out our National Health Service. That's why we're hiring 8,500 more mental health professionals. That's because of a benefit system that was created, decisions taken in 2017, not by Helen, but by some of her colleagues, to say the system's completely binary. You either prove that you are too sick to work or you don't get enough money to live on. And we are going to start putting that right. In terms of, and by the way, I had actually read the press release with the Conservative plan to reform welfare from before the election. It's about a page long and tells you whatever it is, it's not a plan. You were saying we don't know what the emergency budget that Kemi's calling it, referring to Liz Truss's budget, the actual spring statement, but I know what that was. It wasn't a plan. They had 14 years to do something. They didn't just not fix the problem, they caused the problem.
Right. I mean, anyway, you said yesterday in the Commons that the changes didn't go far enough in the way you've said. I think we can play when you talked and stood up in the Commons and said that, and this was the reaction that you got.
Fundamentally, this is too little, too late. The fact is, 5 billion. The fact is, 5 billion just doesn't cut it with a bill so big going up so fast.
I mean, the thing is, you were in government all that time and you had a whopping majority. Why didn't you do anything about it?
So we did, and what the figures will show and what many people know is between the period when we first came into government in 2010 and up to the pandemic, actually, we brought the number of people on benefits right down and we brought unemployment down, and we had historically low levels of unemployment. What we then know is we had the pandemic and things changed, and what we saw, and Torsten has referred to this, is a rising number of people claiming sickness benefits and a particular increase in people claiming sickness benefits for mental health problems, and particularly amongst younger people, which all of us, and I'm sure you as well, are very worried about, because you don't want to see young people going on to a lifetime
but Helen,
benefits.
This is a headline. Hang on, let me show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph, referring to what you're saying. The plans that you had for sickness benefits crackdown, this is in 2023, to wait till after the election. You were putting off and postponing your own plans to cut the £26 billion bill, as it says there, by encouraging people back to work, push back to 2025 by your predecessor, where he was a government minister, the Work and Pension Secretary.
I mean, you can Google right now the set of consultations that we did before the election, some of which are the basis of some of the policies that have... There was one specific consultation which was to do with trying to bring in faster some changes to the work capability assessment, because we knew it wasn't working, in advance of scrapping the work capability assessment, which you have taken on as a policy, albeit you've made it later, so you're delaying something which was an important reform. We had a set of consultations which took place, and as I just said, some of your reforms are based on them. We knew we needed to go further. We said in our manifesto we would go further. But what has really surprised me, and it's why I said it was too little, too late, was that Labour and opposition didn't work out what they wanted to do. And then we've had 8 months since they came into power where some of those reforms were delayed, and they really haven't come up with a substantial alternative plan. Chris?
There's an interesting sort of medium-term question here, Joe, if we think of the conversation today and then the conversation on this programme and others since the turn of the year, which is, does this government or future governments come back and ask the question, is the benefit system sustainable, particularly in the context, the context of the various charts that Faisal was pointing out and the post-pandemic legacy that we've been discussing, but then also that wider conversation that we've been having more recently about defence spending and where national budgets, government budgets, priorities, trade-offs have to come in the next 5 or 10 years.
Right. I mean, the trade-off, as we know, in terms of defence spending so far for the commitment from the government is coming from the cut in international aid. But there is no doubt that within the Labour Party, and we heard MPs yesterday criticising and condemning what the government is doing. So let's hear from one of them. Diane Abbott asked this question, actually, after we left PMQs.
There is nothing moral about cutting benefits for what may be up to 1 million people. This is not about morality. This is about the Treasury's wish to balance the country's books on the back of the most vulnerable and poor people in this society.
Mr. Speaker, she's a passionate advocate and has been for a long time on this issue, and I pay tribute to that. But as she rightly acknowledges, the current system is broken. And this is where I disagree with her. I think 1 in 8 young people, not in employment, training or education, that's 1 million young people. I think that's a moral issue, Mr. Speaker, because all the evidence suggests that someone in that situation at that stage of their life is going to find it incredibly difficult ever to get out of that level of dependency. That cuts across the opportunity and aspiration at the root of my values and Labour values about how we take working people forward. So I do see it as a moral issue. I'm not going to turn away from that. I am genuinely shocked that 1 million people, young people, are in that position, and I'm not prepared to shrug my shoulders and walk past it.
How much concern is there on the backbenches? I mean, how big a potential rebellion could there be when votes actually happen on this issue? Diane Abbott is one important MP on the Labour backbenches, but what does she reflect?
Fascinating just to hear. It's the first time I'd heard that exchange, that you got a sense out loud there of conversations I've heard privately across, if you like, the Labour movement of what it means to be a member of that movement, and you saw it playing out there in those exchanges. We should be clear that Diane Abbott is on the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party, is atypical of the centre of gravity of the current Parliamentary Labour Party, many of whom are, to a greater or lesser extent, in Keir Starmer's image as far as his outlook and his articulation of what he sees as being at the core of Labour values. What I was struck by in the Commons yesterday, Joe, was less the contributions from the likes of Diane Abbott and those on the left who are saying perhaps what you would expect them to say, and I don't say that in any sort of sense to denigrate that point of view, but more about where the median position was. And there was clearly a concern. Now, partly I think that's because we haven't yet seen the impact assessments, so people are asking questions about the exact consequences of this, because there is a widespread acceptance on the Labour benches and elsewhere that the current system is unsustainable. The question is going to be between now and any votes, how MPs react to both the response they get from their constituents and then, crucially, I think, these impact assessments and precisely what impact it could have.
On the impact assessments, where are they? Why haven't they been done? How do you know how much you're going to save and how many people you're going to get back into work?
Well, as normal, those will be published on the day of the spring statement because they contain determinants taken from the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecast, and obviously those can't be published until the actual forecast itself is. So those are coming. No one's going to be hiding from the impact of these changes. But just go to what Chris just said for a second. It's a good thing that I want to be in a party where people take seriously their responsibility towards disabled people and those who are in ill health. They're some of the most vulnerable people in our society. That is what we should all be doing, but there is a consensus right across the party, and I actually think across the country, that we can't carry on as we are. So both those things are true. We should take seriously our responsibilities towards the people with a disability and to those in ill health. And remember, the number of people receiving personal independence payments will still be rising under these plans.
But there are choices, aren't there? There are always choices you can make. Many on the left of the Labour Party have talked about a wealth tax, and we have discussed that. But just picking up on that one point, that people under 22 will no longer be able to claim the incapacity benefit top-up to universal credit. You are the pensions minister. Why are you discriminating, as some people see it, against young people when you could be looking at the pensions triple lock, something you certainly discussed in your previous life at the Resolution Foundation?
Well, what's discriminating against young people is a million young people who are not in education, employment or
And you think taking
training.
the benefits away will get them back in?
No, I think offering them more support. We've got a young person's guarantee that we're introducing the benefit system. You're talking about the changes to the benefits system that's proposed for those who are under 22 yesterday. We're consulting on that. And we're not doing that to save money. That money is earmarked for additional support for those people, because if you look at who says, not everybody, including even young people, will be able to work. And people will still be able to claim personal independence payments.
Sure.
No, but it's really important. At the moment, we are writing off hundreds of thousands of people and saying you are certified by the state as not possible to work at the age of 21, and that is a mistake.
Helen?
Well, this is where I was saying I don't think they've thought this through. I think the announcement that was made yesterday included policies that were put together in a rush under pressure from the Treasury because of the economic mistakes that the Chancellor's made and the fiscal position that she has put the government in.
So what would you do specifically? Because the policy in the manifesto, if I remember it correctly, was to get 12 billion pounds, or move up to that, 12 billion pound savings a year. How?
So things that we believe need to be done is much more work about getting the eligibility right for benefits. As I said earlier, over 7 million people are now on some kind of sickness or disability benefit.
So you'd narrow them much further.
That's a huge number. As I said, it's really important when people are disabled, they get the support that they need. But we are seeing a real rise. As I mentioned earlier, particularly there's a whole debate about, are we seeing mental health problems being over-medicalised? I come here as a mental health campaigner who's campaigned on parity for mental and physical health. But I do think this needs really hard yards, and Labour didn't do this work in opposition. We're determined while in opposition to do the hard thinking on policy and come up with a plan.
Is that what you're doing? Faisal's point about rolling back the rise of mental health applications, because it's certainly made up, I think, an extra half on top of the payments already claimed in personal independence payments. Is that what you're doing? You can't accept the rise in mental health claims of PIP. You need to roll that back.
Well, I don't think any of us should accept the rise in mental ill health. As I said, that's why we're hiring more mental health professionals into the NHS. That's why we put £26 billion into the NHS that's being, from tax measures, being opposed by the Conservatives, as you heard today. So none of that money for the NHS would happen on their watch. Specifically on your question, just to answer it directly, and Chris's question, that's not how the PIP assessment works. It doesn't ask what your condition is, it asks what you're able to do in terms of your daily activity. So it does not directly discriminate between physical and mental health measures. So that's the direct answer to your question.
Right. I mean, Chris, this is obviously going to continue beyond the spring statement next week, because there will be changes and votes and so on. How difficult is it going to be for the government in terms of both its party and trying to find the money that it needs?
So on the party thing, I think the two things we should say at the outset, particularly after a period in politics where numbers and the jeopardy around votes were genuinely potentially imperiling to governments. We're not in that era now. You know, Labour got a colossal majority and they worked very hard to try and build a parliamentary party that was likely to be, broadly speaking, more often than not, loyal to what the government was seeking to do. So in that sense, you know, you can box off the sort of kind of jeopardy we've been occasionally used to, more than occasionally used to in the last 10 years or so. But that's not to say it's awkward. And again, in that exchange, you saw how it drives to the kind of core values of how an individual Labour MP sees their worldview and how they go about doing their role. And that sometimes runs up against what they see the government doing, and that's before we get to the specifics of the impact assessment and how they're mailed.
Which we're going to expect next week, aren't we? Some of these impact assessments.
Chris, I think just to say, Chris, I mean, look,
briefly,
all Labour MPs stood on a platform of delivering change, and it's important. Like for too long, we've had huge problems in the country, whether it's on prisons or the asylum system, that people haven't bothered, the Conservatives didn't bother trying to deal with. So everyone knows, everyone agrees this is a big problem, and we're going to have a government that actually deals with the country's problems.
It's all we have time for. Thank you very much to all of my guests today, and I'll be back with more Politics Live tomorrow on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Have a lovely afternoon.